Well, good morning. My name is Eddie Smith, and I'm sometimes referred to as Mr. Alice. And it's so good to be with you today. I am remembering every time I do Alice's broadcast like this, I'm remembering the time that we were speaking, I think it was in Oklahoma. And for 16 years, we lived in travel trailers and motorhomes and traveled literally 50 weeks a year. We had no home, and we used other people's help to get our phone calls and our mail. And we did it. We're on the road about 50 weeks a year. We take 2 weeks off and go to see our parents each Christmas. But we were at this church in Oklahoma, and Alice made a presentation, and when she got finished, the pastor got up to do his part, and he opened politely by saying, well, that's going to be a hard act to follow. And with my humor, I said, sir, that was no act. And it's not. And so it's funny how we say things without thinking. Believe me, I've had plenty on my plate that way, but it's good to be with you today. And I want to talk to you about soul winning. That's an old term. It kind of evolved back to witnessing, and then it evolved back to nothing, pretty much. Most Christians have never led anybody to Christ. And I want to talk to you especially about an offer that we're making this next week, which will bless you and encourage you and teach you and excite you and motivate you, I hope, to pick up the title of witness. Jesus said, you will be my witnesses. And that's our number one job. And so the issue that I want to bring up is my time that I spent with Arthur Blessed. Arthur Blessed went to be with the Lord this past week, and I've had a lot of time to contemplate and remember. And then I also remembered that many years ago, I'm thinking probably 30 years ago, I recorded about 2 hours of experiences that I had working with Arthur Blessed, and experiences that we had, and I'll share with a few of them with you today to whet your appetite, perhaps. But I have a 2 hour, call it a documentary if you want. It's 2 hours of my recording of what I wrote and recorded 30 years ago. Having worked with Arthur back in 1967. Now, understand, Arthur was 2 years older than me. I'm 82, and he was 84, and he was born again when he was 7 years old, and identified his call as an evangelist when he was 15 years old, and was ordained as a Baptist minister when he was 20 years old, and then later, as most know, he carried a 12-foot cross across 324 countries and every sovereign nation and major island group and territory. He walked that cross 43,000 plus miles. They've calculated that to be 86 million steps, and carried the total weight of 19 billion pounds on foot. He's actually listed in the Guinness Book of World Records, having done all of that. But I'll tell you something, an inside part of that you would never know, unless I were to tell you, because I'm the only other person that knows it. But before we hang up today, I'll do that. But I want to talk about witnessing. Arthur was saved when he was 7 years old. I was saved when I was 5.5 years old. I humor people sometimes by telling them I didn't believe in the virgin birth when I was born again. when I got born again, but then again, I wouldn't have known what a virgin was. But because I was born again, when I learned that story, I did understand it and I did believe it. So you don't have to know everything to come to Christ. And so I was 9 years old when I realized that I was an evangelist. I came home one day from riding my bike and walked in the back door, through the kitchen, past my mother and father, and upstairs to my bedroom, and fell across my bed weeping, and had my Bible in my hand. But my dad came up. My dad was a Southern Baptist pastor, missionary, head of the Southern Baptist Foreign Mission Board 2 terms, and so he was a wonderful man, and pastored several churches in Texas, and then was also a school principal in a school that spoke only Spanish, which is interesting because he didn't speak Spanish until he was 65, and at age 65 he enrolled in college to learn to speak Spanish, and because he wanted to preach in Spanish, having started 50 churches in Old Mexico, and he preached in Spanish for 20 years. So he set a terrible example for me. I can't live up to any of that, but what an amazing man he was. Some of you know him, and some of you were in his churches that he pastored. But one day, as I fell across my bed crying, my dad came upstairs, walked into my room to comfort me, and asked me what was wrong. And I told him, I said, Dad, I was on my bicycle and I went downtown to Mr. Kosanke's store, and because I've heard you and Mom talk about the fact that he doesn't know Jesus and that he's going to spend eternity in hell if he doesn't get born again. And so I went down to his store so I could share the gospel with him. But I got to the door, but I got scared, and I just couldn't do it. And I began to weep more. And my father patted me on the shoulder and he said, "Don't worry about it, son." He said, "You've been faithful." And he left. And he came back. Years later, he told me what he did. He said, hearing you so heartbroken over Mr. Kosanke's condition, he said, I got in my car and drove down to his store and went inside and said, hey, come with me. I want to show you something. And so they went out and got in his car, my dad's car, and drove around remember the old Texas towns had a courthouse in the middle. Many of them still do. A courthouse in the middle. And he said, we drove around the courthouse while I shared with Mr. Kosanke the gospel of Christ and invited him to pray and receive Christ as his Lord and Savior. So at 9 years old, I knew what I was here for. I was a sailor in the U.S. Navy in San Diego mostly when I wasn't overseas. And so as a sailor, they made me a chaplain's assistant. And that was a good job for me because I was having a preacher daddy. I knew how to do that. But when I got out of the Navy, I became minister of music at a church there in San Diego and was working at a business and to support myself. And in that church, we had a revival, and Arthur Blessed was invited to preach that revival. At the time, he lived in Redlands, California. And Arthur said, when the service is over tonight, Eddie, he said, I want you to go with me. We're going to go out on the street and witness. Well, I didn't know what he was up to, but I discovered that he had made a commitment to Christ, that he would not go to sleep until he had led at least one person to Christ that day. That was his life commitment. And you may, if you saw the special that celebrated his life, you may remember, or you may have read where he wrote at one point that he was anxious to see Jesus again. What that means is he had a visitation from Jesus early in his life, and when we met and began working together, he told me that amazing story. And as I recall, Jesus came walking on the water at a lake where he was at an encampment, and spoke to him, and that was a major experience in his life that shaped him. But in any case, after each revival service, it didn't matter how many people walked the aisle and got saved. That didn't count because they weren't personally. So we would go back to his hotel room. He would go in and take his tie off and put on a sports shirt, and then we would go out to the bars and nightclubs in San Diego, which mostly were filled with sailors, which I had been one, and we would share Christ with them. And I remember one night we went to Tattoo Eddie's place. He had a tattoo shop there in San Diego, and of course sailors were most of his customers. And when we walked in, he asked us what we wanted, and Arthur said, "I want to get a tattoo." And he said, "Where do you want to get it?" He said, "I want to get it on the back of my hand." And he said, "You want a tattoo on the back of your hand?" He said, "Yes, sir." He said, "What do you want it to be?" And he said, "Well, get a pad and paper there." And so he got a pen and paper, and he said, "I want it to say, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." Now, Tattoo Eddie is writing this down, and then he said, "Then I want it to say, the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life." And Tattoo Eddie got about halfway through that line, and then he stopped and said, "Why do you want this on your hand?" And Arthur said, "So when I shake hands with people, they can see the gospel and be saved." Tattoo Eddie, have you ever trusted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? And so there began the evening. And every night after the revival services, it was like that. I recall one night, and by the way, some of what I'll tell you today is likely going to be on the 2 hours of recording. One or two of them might be there, but I just don't recall. Again, I recorded them 30 years ago. But we had finished the service, got him out of his suit and tie, and we went to a pizza restaurant. And when we walked in, there was a sailor sitting alone at one of the tables. And Arthur walked over, and I'm behind him, and he got the sailor's attention. He said, "Good evening, sir." And he said, "Good evening." And he said, "You mind if we sit down with you and have dinner?" And he said, "Yeah, I do mind." And Arthur said, "Okay." He said, "I want to be alone." And Arthur said, "All right." So we found a table nearby and ordered our food, and we're eating our food, and all of a sudden the sailor got up and went to the restroom. Well, as you will learn on the audios that I will be sharing this next week, and they'll be downloadable audios, like a downloadable audio book actually, and 2 parts because they're long. And my job with Arthur, and it has been true in many cases throughout my life and different ministries that I've worked with, my job was to create opportunity. And I never really understood that. I knew it because it happened all the time as I just operated under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. But I didn't know, and I don't know which spiritual gift that would relate to, by the way. But my job was to create opportunity. And so the sailor got up and went to the restroom, and I got up and went over and took his pizza, left what was left on his pizza plate and his drink and his silverware and his napkin, and brought them over and put them on our table. And when he came out of the restroom, he walked over to finish his dinner, and he realized that his beer and his pizza were gone. And he got the waiter's attention and said, why did you take I wasn't finished eating. And I got his attention. I said, "Sir, your stuff is right here." And he came over and he said, "Who put it here?" I said, "I did." And I said, "Have a seat." So he did sit down. He was drunk, by the way, which is why I took the liberty. We worked a lot with drunks. I will assure you, a drunk, you can do almost anything to a drunk, but you can't touch his wallet. If you touch his money, you're in trouble. But you can walk up to a drunk, as I'll tell you in a second, and you can take gospel tracts and stick them in all of his shirt pocket, his coat pocket, his inside coat pocket, and he just smiles and goes on. He doesn't even realize what you did, and doesn't respond at all. But if you reach for his wallet, you've got a problem. So it's interesting about inebriation and drunkenness. But Arthur began sharing the gospel with the gentleman, And I began to ask him about himself, and he said that he had been a young married man, lived in Northern California, and his wife died in childbirth, as did the baby. And he said it so upset him that he said he would never go back to church again, and he joined the Navy to get away from all of the memory of that. And when he said we were in church, and my wife was a strong Christian, but she died, and I said, well, praise God. And he said, what did you say? And I said, praise God. And he doubled up his fist, and he leaned toward me, and he said, why did you say that? I said, because your wife doesn't have to see you drunken like you are now. She's in heaven in total peace. But if she were still here, she would see you in your drunken state, and that wouldn't be good for her or your child. He calmed down a little bit, and when we finished eating, he got up to leave, and I said, do you need a ride back to the base? And he said he did. And so we got in the car, drove him back to the base, and said good night to him. And he had not, at that point, trusted Christ, but he heard the gospel clearly, and he had grown up in church, so he knew that. And the next night, we were back in our services, and several people had walked the aisle to receive Christ and to make other decisions and to give testimonies. And one of them was familiar, but I didn't quite place him because it was the sailor that we were at the restaurant with the night before that we took back to the base, but he was in civilian clothes, so it didn't come to me until I realized it. And then he said he came to give a testimony. Well, we would let people give testimonies pretty much at the drop of the hat, and usually would carry our own hat, but I handed him the microphone, and he stood in front of the congregation, told them, he said, these two came into the pizza shop last night, and this one took my plate and put it on his table when I told him I didn't want to eat with him, but he did it anyway. And he said, and then they started talking about Jesus, and he said, and I told him about my wife and child who died, and this guy said, praise God, and I just wanted to hit him. And then he explained why, and then I realized how right he was. And they took me back to the naval station, and I got out, and as I was going up the gangplank to the gang, whatever you call it's been a long time since I was in the Navy, the gangplank to the ship, I just fell to my knees, and when I did, two military policemen MPs came over, and were about to arrest me and get me where I needed to be. And I told him, I said, I'm okay. He said, I'm just praying. I'm asking Jesus to forgive me and come into my heart. And you two guys need to do the same thing. Believe me. And he said, they helped me get up on the ship, and I went to bed. The next morning, I got out of bed, and I walked out, got my Winston's, his cigarettes, and he said, I went out on the deck and outside and was ready to smoke a cigarette, and then realized I shouldn't be smoking these, and this isn't right. And he said, I threw them as far as I could throw them, and they landed somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. And he said, I went back into my office. He was in the art department on the cruiser. Believe it or not, there are people on cruiser, or there was, at least in that day, there were people on the cruiser that there was a print shop on the cruiser, and artists and typesetters and whatever. And he was one of those. And he said, I went to my art board, and I took a red New Testament that I was given somewhere sometime, and well, here's what I did. And he reached in his pocket and pulled out his red New Testament. You may recall Winston's cigarettes were red. And he turned it like that, and it didn't say Winston's, it said wisdom. And he said, so when anybody asks me for a smoke now, I don't reach for my Winston's, I reach for my wisdom. And so that was his testimony. And that was one night with Arthur, and then Tattoo Eddie was another. And there were many more that night, that week. But, and just give you one more. We were walking down the street, and this businessman came out. He had a silk suit on, alligator shoes, presidential Rolex. He looked like $1 million. And as he walked by me, and he was drunk, And as he walked by me, I stopped him and I said, "Excuse me a second." And I reached over and opened up the suit coat that he had on and put a handful of gospel tracts in there and blessed him and told him good night. And he left. And 2 weeks later, we were up in Los Angeles because, as I'll say in a moment, we moved up there together to start working on Sunset Strip. And we were about to go conduct a revival. I did the music and Arthur did the preaching. In fact, I don't know if you can see this or not, but that's us back then. We were cute. He's got his Bible. I've got my guitar. And that was in 1967. So we had moved up there and we had opened up an office on Sunset Strip. There you go. Arthur Blessed Evangelist, R. Eddie Smith, that's the way I used my name back then. Associate Evangelist and Gospel Singer. Nightlife Evangelist, Arthur Blessed Evangelistic Association, Outreach for Christ, P.O. Box, that was one of the early zip codes, I guess. And then our phone numbers had no, my phone number now has a prefix. There's no prefix there. And then the one on the other side is office and residence. And our address is on there. You can't see it, I don't think. Yeah, you might. 8535 Sunset Boulevard. You can get on Google Earth and go to 8535 Sunset Boulevard and see the office that we had. It was formerly the Monkees. Remember the Monkees? Rock and roll group. It was their mail office where they received mail and their mail was sorted and dealt with there. And so that was our office. And by the way, one night at Capitol Records, Arthur and I were walking through the foyer and bumped into the Monkees. And I took time, I forget who he talked to, but I talked to Mickey Dolenz and shared Christ with him. And so we had some unique opportunities to share Christ, including with Johnny Carson one night. I shared Christ with him in Las Vegas. Back to my story, let's see where I was. 2 weeks after the revival, I got a call. I felt like the Lord told me that I was supposed to go to work with Arthur. We had had so much success together on the streets of San Diego during that week revival that I felt like perhaps I was supposed to work for him. And I'll get back to the guy with the silk suit in a minute. And so I went to Redlands and knocked on his door and told him that I feel like God's called me to work with you. I was applying for a job, I guess. And he shrieked, as did his wife, and they said, "We were praying all day yesterday and fasting that God would send you here." And so, well, God did. And he said, "Monday, we're going to move to Hollywood and go out on Sunset Strip and begin a ministry there, reaching out to the hippies and motorcycle gangs and others. And so why don't you move up there too?" So I did. And so he got one apartment, and I was across the hall from him, and another one, same floor, on the second floor of the building, in the Fairfax area of Los Angeles, which is where CBS Television City is, where they did The Price is Right and that sort of thing. And so now we're working on Sunset Strip, and I'll tell you about our first night in a moment, but let me finish the other story. Now that we're in Los Angeles working together, we had a revival coming up in another city, and we didn't have the gas money to get there. Because we were just doing everything by faith. Neither of us had a job. Neither of us thought about a job. We felt like our job was to do what we were doing. And so we trusted God, and we needed money to do that revival. And I went to get the mail, and at the post office, and came home with a letter from Puerto Rico, which made no sense at all. We knew no one in Puerto Rico, and it was an oil company in Puerto Rico, and that didn't make any sense to us either. And I opened it up, and in it was a letter and a check for $500. Now, $500 is a lot today, but it was a whole lot back then. And the letter said, I was walking down the street in San Diego, California a couple of weeks ago, and one of you stuck some gospel tracts in my, he didn't call them that, but in my coat pocket. When I got back to the hotel, he said I was reading them, and God spoke to me and said that I needed him. And I prayed that prayer that was in the gospel tract, and God transformed my life. Please use this to help you continue doing what you're doing for people. And so we had the money to do our revival, and that was not uncommon back then. So Arthur and I, the first night, I'll never forget the first night, because you know, it's interesting about fear. Some people let fear stop them. We let fear prompt us. So we let fear push us rather than prevent us. And so we would take the energy that fear would produce and we would turn it into power for the gospel's sake. And that's got me to share Christ in, with my son Robert, to share Christ in an Indian temple, the Temple of Kali, a Hindu temple in Calcutta. And he and I went in there, and I was able to share Christ with the people inside that temple, preached to them until the temple guards threw us out, but that's another story. But fear's always there, so you don't worry about fear. You understand that it's not going to prevent me, it's going to prompt me, and it's going to promote me, and it's going to give me the energy and the power that I need to do what I know I'm supposed to do. So that first night, we got out on the street, filled up our pockets with gospel tracts. That didn't last long, because gospel tracts, if you're not familiar with them, they're just little pamphlets that tell people how to be born again. And ours was quite simple. It just said, if you were to die tonight, the big question, if you died tonight, do you have the assurance in your heart you'd be in heaven? And then it had the 4 steps of the Roman road, Romans 3:23, Romans 6:23, Romans 5:8, and Romans 10:9, 10, and 13. And on the back was a prayer that you can pray to invite Christ into your life and to surrender and repent and make him your Lord. And so that was it. And it wasn't long. In fact, it was quite quickly. We realized you can't go out on Sunset Strip where thousands of people are gathering at night, back to back and belly to belly, as the old song said. And you can't even walk down the street hardly. You have to move past people, and gospel tracts were the only way to communicate with them in many cases, or at least to begin a communication with them in many cases. And so we had scabbards made, I guess that's the word for it, a holster on our belt, and we could put about 300 gospel tracts in that holster, and that would take us about an hour to get rid of. And so the gospel tracts were an important part of what we did. And I lost my train of thought there, but that's not uncommon when you're my age. I stopped at a service station one time. One of the strangest experiences I've had. There was a young man working there. It was late at night, and I stopped and I said, "If you died tonight, do you have the assurance in your heart that you would go to heaven?" And he said, "I'm not going to die tonight." And I said, "Well, none of us know." And he said, "Well, I know." And I said, "Well, there's really no way to know. Everybody dies. We all know that." He said, "But not me." And I said, "Are you serious?" And he said, "Yes, sir." And I said, "Well, if you don't believe you're going to die tonight, why don't you walk out there and lay down in the middle of the street and let that 18-wheel truck that's coming roll over you and prove to me that you're not going to die?" He said, "Sir, if I have to go to that extent to prove it to you, I'm admitting that there's some question about it, and there is no question about it. I don't think he learned anything that night, but I did. I learned that arguing the point was not going to get anybody anywhere. Once after that, I was on a plane sitting beside a businessman and began to witness to him, and he said, look, he said, you can't prove there's a heaven and a hell. And I said, well, of course I can't. I said, I wouldn't try. He said, why? I said, well, if I try to prove it to you, then I'm admitting by doing so that there's some question about it. There is no question about it. And he was stumped as much as I had been. So I learned that from a young guy at a service station in San Diego. Arthur was, we'd finish around 2 in the morning. We'd head back to our apartments, and we were leaving one night, and Arthur said, I'm having a vision. He said, there's a man that wants to know how to be saved. Go straight. And I said, aren't we going home? He said, no, go straight. And so I followed his instruction. He put his head down between his knees and just labored there in this vision. And he said, turn right at the next street. And I did. And after about 20 minutes, going to an area of Los Angeles neither of us knew anything about, he said, turn right at the next street and pull over and park. And so I did. And he said, he's here. And I said, who's here? He said, the man that wants to be saved. And I said, Arthur, I'm looking out around the car. I don't see any man that wants to be saved. He said, he's upstairs. And I'm looking out my window. I see nothing. I can't see upstairs on his side. So I had to duck way down, and I saw a light on. And there was a man sitting inside that upstairs room. You could see his silhouette on the window. And I said, well, there is a man up there. He said, well, go share Christ with him. He wants to be born again. I said, Arthur, it's your vision. You go share Christ with him. So Arthur did. And he went and knocked on the door, and the man came to the door, invited him in. He told him what he had come to do, and the man told him, he said, that's so interesting. He said, I was just praying and asking God for someone to show me that. And so working with Arthur was always a challenge. It was always an opportunity. It was always an interesting involvement. I'm trying to think if there's, I don't want to tell too much because I want you to get the album and you'll be able to listen to it several times and share it with others. Dean Martin had a restaurant called Dino's on Sunset Strip, and it was a few blocks, 3 or 4 blocks from our office. I suppose it's still there, but I don't know if it's still called that, but it was a popular place to meet at the time. And one night there, a man was burning $100 bills in the fireplace. Again, another drunk, of course, and he's showing these $100 bills, taking them out of his wallet and walking over and putting them in the fireplace and burning them. Well, Arthur and I, we didn't have $100, so we felt really badly that he was burning the $100, but we also realized that he needed Christ. And so Arthur went over to him and told him, he said, sir, I want to talk to you. He said, what do you want to talk about? He said, I want to talk to you about God. And he said, I don't want to talk about God. And Arthur convinced him that he needed to. And they went over to another part of this building, because there were a lot of people in there, went over to another part of the building, and they were up on a ledge. Imagine a stage 3 feet up from the floor, and a rail around it, and chairs and tables up there. That's where they were. And they were talking, and they were standing there. And suddenly the man objected to the gospel, and suddenly Arthur prayed for him, And when he prayed for him, the man literally flipped over the rail and onto the floor down below, unhurt. And he got up and he said, okay, I get it. Come to my house. And he wrote down his address. And I didn't tell you, Arthur's opening line with him was, "Sir, I hope your soul doesn't burn in hell like you're burning those $100 bills." And that's what got his attention. Well, we went up to his house. He was a multimillionaire, lived up in a house on the hill above Sunset Strip. And it was there that he gave his heart to Christ. Let me tell you that sharing Christ is not difficult. It's not even complicated. In fact, when I have dinner somewhere, if there's not any obstruction and too many people around where I might embarrass someone, I will ask the waiter or waitress as they leave, which I did a day or two ago, having lunch with a pastor friend of mine and his wife, Alice and I were, and when the young waiter took our order, I said, before you go back to get to place the order, we're going to pray over our food. Is there anything that you need that we can pray for you? And he stopped and he thought seriously, and then he gave us his prayer request. It was for a friend. And so the most memorable time that I remember happening was over on 610 North. There was at least at the time, there was a Denny's restaurant, and I was eating in there alone, and this middle-aged, I almost said elderly black lady. I'm elderly. She wasn't elderly. She was older than me, basically. She came to our table to serve me, and as she turned to leave, I said, "Ma'am," I said, "while you're gone, we're going to pray for this food. And is there anything that I can pray for you about?" And she stopped and startled me for a second. She had an odd look on her face, and then tears welled up in her eyes and rolled down her cheeks. And she said, "Sir, that's the most generous gift anyone's ever given me." No, it wasn't that simple. Let me tell you how not to do it. Alice and I were having dinner with a group of pastors at the old Steak and Ale. Remember the Steak and Ale down near 610 off of 290, on 290 and near 610? They tore it down now. I think it's a Gentleman's Club now, which is a sorry name for a place like that today. But it was a great steak place, and we ate there many, many times. And that night we had about 8 pastors around the table. And when the waiter came out to take our drink orders, the young pastor next to me stopped him when he turned around, and it was, if you remember, they had little rooms that they would put you in with your group, and we were in one of these small rooms. It might have been 8 by 10, and with about 4 tables in it full of people. And this young pastor said, "Before you go to get our drink orders, let me ask you a question, young man. Has there ever been a time in your life when you've trusted Christ as your Lord and Savior?" And the man said, "No, I need to work, and I'm sorry, but I need to get this drink order in." And he said, "But there's nothing more important than your eternal security. And would you like for me to share with you how you can know that you..." And when he finished and the young man finally was able to escape, I told the young pastor, I said, "You should be ashamed." All of the pastors at the table probably wondered what I was going to say. I said, "You just humiliated a young man who needs Christ." There are ways to share Christ, and there are ways not to share him. One way is, don't begin by humiliating the person you're trying to share Christ with. There was an amazing pianist years ago that we worked with for a while, and it was determined that he was involved in homosexuality, and he got terminated. He was fired. And when he was fired, he never came back, of course. And a week or two after he was fired, I was able to find out where he worked. He worked over on the other side of Houston. And so one night, I got in my car and I drove over to that restaurant where he worked. And I went in, and it was a house, IHOP place. And I went in and I saw him working, and I went over to him and got his attention, and he saw me, and he was a little bit embarrassed and put off at first. And then I invited him over, and I told him, I said, when is your next break? He said, it's at 8. And I said, can I sit over here, and would you allow me to talk with you for a few minutes? And he said, sure. So I went over and sat quietly and waited for him to get free from his busyness and to get over to me where there was a quiet area. And I shared Christ with him, and he trusted Christ that night and gave his heart to Christ. It was just a few months later when he died, probably of AIDS. Back then they didn't talk about that. They would give it some other name. You know, he had kidney problems or whatever. But I was so glad that I did take the time to go talk to him and to share with him the gospel and to lead him in repentance and faith. One last story. I was in Tulsa, and I was involved in a revival meeting there. And I went to the Christian bookstore I was told about and did some shopping there. I wanted to see, for one thing, if any of my books were being sold there. And I had music back then that I was involved in too, because music was my background and my college training. And Alice and I made 11 albums. Oh, and I didn't tell you this one, and I should tell you before I take you to Tulsa. I went to see Arthur one day. I had left working with him and moved to Houston. And I went back to see him, and that day I had gone back because I was making an album, and this is how albums are often made. It was 10 of my songs that I'd written, and I was the singer, and the orchestra was in London. Well, I didn't go to London. The producer and the director and the arranger went to London and made the backgrounds, brought them back. Then I went to California to a studio there near Hollywood and did the voiceovers, sang with the backgrounds and recorded all that. That made the album. Then the record producer flew me to Nashville where I had the photograph for the cover made. So it was a complicated thing back then, not nearly so today. And it was with a real orchestra, which they didn't have all the electronic orchestrations that we have today. But I decided, since I'm going to Los Angeles, I got to see Arthur. So I stopped and got a cab, and I went to his office. At that time, he had opened up a Christian nightclub there called His Place. And so I went in, and he was glad to see me, and we rejoiced to see each other. And he took me to his office, and we sat down and talked about family and other things. And all of a sudden, he said, see that cross in the corner? And I looked over, and there was a wooden cross in the corner. It was made by 4x4s, so the rods of the cross were that thick, and there was a wheel, and the upright, the horizontal and the vertical were bolted together, and there was a wheel at the bottom. Later, I learned that he would take the pieces apart and then put them in a zip bag, almost like skis or a set of golf clubs, and that's how he would fly on the plane with them later. But he pointed to that, and he said, I'm taking that to Washington, D.C. And I said, do they need that in Washington, D.C.? And he said, well, they need that and a lot more, but God's told me to take it there. I said, well, how are you going to get it on the plane? He said, well, I'm not flying. And I said, what? He said, I'm not flying. I said, you're going to drive to Washington? No, I'm going to walk to Washington. I said, Arthur, that's impossible. By the way, this is a bit of confession to you to show you how dumb I was. I said, it's impossible for a human being to walk from Los Angeles to D.C. That's, 3,000 miles or something? You can't do that. He said, but God told me to do it. And I said, whoa. And he said one other thing. He said, the doctors have just found an aneurysm on my brain, And the doctor told me that it could explode at any time. If it bursts, that I'll die. There's no way around that. But he says that I should have it corrected. And I said, well, let's do that. He said, well, I can't do that. And I said, why? He said, because I'm leaving Friday. And this was like Tuesday maybe. I'm leaving Friday. And I said, you're leaving Friday to carry across the United States because God told you to, and you've got a brain aneurysm that could burst and kill you. And he said, yes. I said, let me give you an alternative plan. He said, okay. And he said, you get your surgery, you get well, you get strong, you get fit and prepared, and a year from now, leave on your walk to Washington, D.C. Between now and then, I'll get in my car. I won't walk. I'll get in my car and I'll go the path that you're going to take, and I'll stop at each fairly large city, and I'll have a meeting with pastors, and we will rent a stadium in each of those cities, and when you get to that town, their churches can go out and meet you at the city limits, walk with you to the stadium. You can do a crusade in the stadium. You'll have it packed with people. You'll have people born again. Then they can walk with you to the exit of the city, and you can walk to the next city and do the same thing. You can do probably 10 or 15 conferences or crusades between here and D.C. and have a great evangelistic opportunity. He said, there's only one problem. And I said, what? He said, God said leave Friday. So I almost talked him out of doing what he is known for, which is one of my lowlights, I suppose. Well, back to Tulsa, and I'll finish with this, I promise. I went into the bookstore, and I don't recall if I found what I was looking for or not. But as I was leaving, there was a middle-aged woman over at the cash register, and as I walked up, I asked her, I said, ma'am, could I ask you a quick question? And she said, yes. I said, if you were to die tonight, do you have the assurance in your heart that you would go to heaven? She said, yes, sir, I do. But thank you for asking. Oh, sir, I've worked here for almost 30 years. The only people that come in here are Christians. Mostly pastors and assistant pastors and ministers of music and solid Christians that come to buy books to read about Jesus. In 30 years, you're the first person that's ever told me how to get saved or asked me if I was lost. I know him. Do you see the pretty girl over in the corner? And I said, yes, ma'am. She said, she just started working here and she doesn't know Jesus. Would you share with her? And I said, sure. So I went over and I did share with her. And she found Christ that day. And both me and the older lady rejoiced in the fact that she had found Christ. And one more story. There's just so many of them. But the ones on the tape are primarily about Arthur and me and what I learned from him, including an amazing story about Roy Rogers and Dale Evans and their Apple Valley Inn in California, where we went to witness one night. But the story I want to tell you is right here in Houston. In fact, we were over on the south side of Houston going to see Alice's mother and father in Lake Jackson, Texas. And we stopped at a truck stop, and the waitress, and this, I want to give this to you because it's another creative way. You see, there are ways to witness. There are ways to witness with the word. There are ways to witness with the elements. There are ways to witness with your surroundings. There are creative ways to witness, which has usually worked best for me, and this would be an example. You won't read this in a book probably, unless I write it, but in that truck stop, this lady came over to serve us, and I've always doubled my tips for women that work at night, because I realize if they're working in a restaurant at night, they probably have a husband and a family at home, or maybe no husband and a family at home, and they need help. So I double my tips pretty much after dark if it's a lady. And when she came to service, I asked her, she started to go get the drinks. I said, ma'am, could you tell me, just a minute, could you tell me what this is for? And I pointed at my plate, and she said, "Well, sir, that's your plate. And what's its purpose? What is it for?" She said, "Of course, it's to hold your food." And I said, "And what's this for?" And I pointed to my glass, and she said, "It's your glass." And I said, "And what's it for?" She said, "It's to contain your drink." And I said, "Okay. One more question." She said, "Okay." And I touched her on the arm, and I said, "And what's this for?" And she said, "Me?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "I don't know." I said, "Don't you find that interesting? That you know the purpose for the plate, you know the purpose for the drink, the glass, but you don't know your purpose?" And she said, "Yes, that is interesting." And before we left that night, she gave her heart to Christ. Well, a week later, we came back that way, coming back to our house in Houston, and we stopped in that truck stop just to check on her. And when we stopped to check on her, she saw us come in the door, and she ran to the kitchen, and she got the cook, and he came out with that white hat that they wear. And she said, "This is Tom." She said, "I've told him what you guys did last week and how it changed my life, and he wants to know too." So we were able to share the gospel with Tom that night as well. Well, I run those rabbits, and I'm just shooting from the hip, as you can tell. And I did promise to tell you about the first night with Arthur on Sunset Strip, so I've got to tell you that to keep the promise. But this has been almost an hour of stories, but there's 2 hours of stories about Arthur primarily on the audiobook that we'll offer next week. But the first night on the Strip, we went out. We had no idea where we were going. We ended up on Hollywood Boulevard, and we walked up to the door of an old house that had been being used for. There was nothing different about it. It was just an old house with a sign out front, which was a photo studio. Well, a photo studio back then was a place where men would come in, they would pay, they would get a Polaroid camera and a girl, and they would take her back into a room and take whatever pictures they wanted to take of her that she would allow them to take, and they would pay for that, and that's what they were. They were nude modeling studios, basically. I think that was the term they used for them, modeling studios. And so I said, "Well, Arthur, let's go in there." So we're not to Sunset Strip yet, but we walked in there. And when we walked in there, it was decorated a little bit like a large living room in a home with couches and chairs. And there was 4 to 6, I forget how many of there were, scantily clad ladies, beautiful ladies, sitting in different places and anxious for a man to come in and spend some money, of course. And the leader, I suppose, of the group came over and said, "Well, what can we do for you tonight?" And I said, "Well, you could answer a question for me. We came in here to talk to you about your soul. And the question would be this: if you died tonight, do you have the assurance in your heart that you would go to heaven?" Well, that irritated her. That's not why she's there, and she's not looking for that sort of a discussion at the time. And she put her hands on her hips and threw her head back, and she said, "Perhaps you'd like to speak to our manager." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, that's exactly what we want to do. Let us speak to your manager." So she left and came back with a young man in his mid-20s, and I found out later he was from Brazil, and he was a new, he didn't illegally come into the country. He had come into the country legally, and probably on a student permission to study at the university there in Los Angeles. But he came in the room, and he said, "Do you want to speak to me?" And I said, "Yes, sir. Is there a quiet place?" He said, "Yeah, come back here." So he took us back to his office, and we led him to Jesus. And when we finished, I had about 40 gospel tracts, and I gave them to him, and I said, "Give these to people that you meet, people that you know, people that you think need what God just did for you." And So he said he would, and we said good night, and we left and went on to the strip and continued our work. A couple of weeks later, we went out, and I told Arthur, we're going to pass that modeling studio tonight. Let's go in there and check on him. You know, he was our first convert here. And so we did go in. And the lady saw us come in, and she immediately ran to his office and said, Jim, they're here to talk to you. And he came out, and he got us, and he was happy to see us. He invited us back to his office, and he told us, he said, you know, I really appreciate the fact that you guys came in here. He said, my life is totally different now. He said, you know the Bibles you gave me? That's what he thought the gospel tracts were. He said, I gave them all away, and then I didn't have one. And then I wanted to read a Bible, and I felt like God was telling me I ought to read a Bible, but I didn't have one. And I checked the drugstore and the grocery store. I can't find any place around here that sells a Bible. Can you get me one? And I said, yes, we'll get you a Bible. And he said, and there's another thing. And I said, what's that? He said, I'm not supposed to work here. And I said, well, who told you that? He said, I guess God. He said, I just feel like in my heart that I'm not supposed to work here. This doesn't please him. And I said, well, let's get you in a church and get you a job. So we helped him get into a church. And in the church, a man hired him. And so he was no longer the manager of the nude modeling studio. And many more stories like that with Arthur, and ways that God used him, and ways that he impacted my life and the lives of many others. We'll talk to you soon, and be on the lookout for those audios next week. God bless you, and thank you for listening.